Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to lesson 3 of the NodeJS REST API course. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Now in today's video, we are going to further improve our REST API service by introducing something called a post request handler. Now the first question you are probably having is, why exactly do we need this thing in the first place? Well, let me show you an example of a form inside of a web application over here. And so on this dummy server, I have this form that allows me to create a user with a first and last name. So I'm going to create Kobe Bryant over here, and I'll just hit this submit button, and it'll actually send that information to this route called user and create. And if I go back to my user's route over here and just hit enter, you'll see that Kobe Bryant was created using that form. Now, the thing with web applications is that whenever you're creating something on your server, oftentimes it's done through a post request instead of a regular GET request because of a lot of different reasons that we'll discuss later on. So in today's video, we are going to go ahead and kind of take a look at how we can serve some raw HTML files, such as a user creation form. And then once we kind of get that done, we'll look at how to create a post request with our application so that we can process all that data and then create a new row inside of MySQL. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and begin with Visual Studio Code right now. All right, everybody, we are now back inside of Visual Studio Code. And we're currently inside of the app.js file where we've coded up everything for our application server. Now, the first thing I would like to do is to start up my server by saying node mod app.js inside of the terminal below. And we're currently listening on the port of 3003. If I refresh this page at the user's route, I am now listing all of my users from the actual database. So that's a small modification that I made for our application server. And in the very last video, we introduced another route called user ID. So if I try to search for the ID of 2, I'll get Steph Curry over there. So let me just show you what that is with user and 2. And that's pretty much what we've done so far in the past 2 videos. Hopefully you guys were able to understand everything so far. And I hope you're ready to move on with the next step inside of our REST API course, which is to create a form that kind of looks like this over here. Now, this is a different server that is on port 8888 that has this form available. If I try to access this guy on this server using form.html, you will see that we cannot get this form because we don't have this file inside of our server and we're not serving it in any way. All right, so in addition to that, down in the console below, you'll see that we have this 404, which is page not found. And I would like to go all the way up to the top of the app.js file to modify this Morgan logger to use short instead. And if I try to refresh now, you can see exactly what's happening, a little bit more obvious. All right, so hopefully that is helpful. And the first thing I would like to show you how to do in today's lesson is to create this form using some HTML syntax. And the way I'm going to do that is to first create a new folder inside of my project somewhere. And I'll just call this public. And inside of public, I'll create a new file. So just hit that plus button over there. And I'm just going to call this form.html just to make it super simple. And so inside of here, I'm going to introduce some HTML syntax, and hopefully you guys are aware of how to use HTML. I know not all of you guys are web developers, but this is pretty easy to follow. So I'm just going to type it out and you should be able to follow along pretty easily. And the thing that is going to be shown inside of my HTML is something very, very simple. So I'm just going to say hello from div, and I'll hit the save button. Now this form HTML, if we try to access it again instead of our server at 3003, we still get that same error of 404 and page not found. So let me show you how to actually fix this by serving some static files inside of my application server. And this is actually very, very easy. If you go up to the top of your app.js file, and inside of here, I'm going to say app use, so just regular use, and express.static. And let me just type out this code here with /public. And let me hit the save. The server is going to restart. and I'll refresh this page over here and we'll see hello from div at form.html. So the way that this line of code works is your application server is now serving all of the files inside of the public directory, which is over here, and you can just access it using the root and whatever the file name is called, kind of like form HTML over there. So you can imagine if you had more files, you can just access it using whatever that name is called. And so now that we have this form over here, why don't we take a look at how we can modify it so that it looks a little bit more like a real form with some input fields like first name and last name. So let's go back to form HTML, and this guy, why don't we just say, create a user by filling out the fields below, and over here I'm just going to say form for my form. And to create a form, it's actually very easy. You simply want to include some inputs in here, and for the input you can use a placeholder of first name. Let's do that, hit the save, go back to this guy, refresh, and you'll see the first name field right over there. Now if you copy this and introduce last name, you'll get that over there. Let me just use an HR divider line, hit the save and refresh. You'll get the HR, the horizontal rule, I believe that's called. And then you have first name and last name. Now, in addition to those two fields, you might want to use a submit button as well. So the submit button, you can just say button like that. And for the button, you just want to type in some text in there and you'll see it on the right side. So this guy, let's just call it submit. That is a pretty standard piece of text for your button. So now you can just say submit. And every time I'm making a change, I'm actually saving it and then refreshing it. That's why the changes are there. And now what you want to do is to actually fill out this guy and then hit the submit button, right? So right now, when you hit the submit button, it kind of just hits the server URL again, and then you get this new page to render with nothing inside of it. So let's modify this so that we can actually send this data to our server somehow. And the question is, how do we do that? Well, this is pretty easy. If we modify form and just give it an action like that. So the action, I will say, let's see, user underscore create, and hit the save. Now, if I hit the submit button, or let's say refresh first, and let's say 1 and 2, hit the submit a couple of times, you will see that we're actually trying to hit the user create route using a GET request like that. So to modify this to actually use a POST request, which is a little bit better, you can say method, and we'll just use POST like that, and we'll hit save, and we will go back to form HTML. We'll say AA, BBB, and hit the submit. And down below, you'll see that we're now hitting the server with a POST request at the route of user create. All right, so it is still giving us a 404 because this route hasn't been created inside of app.js just yet. So why don't we go ahead and create this guy? All right, so this is very, very simple. If you just say app, and typically you use a get for a get request, obviously. And now we're just going to use a post like that. And the route that we need to create is the user create route like so. And we will pass it in a callback of request, response, fat arrow, and brace. And console over here, let's log a message of, trying to create a new user. All right, so over here, we will just say res.end to end this request. And now we can save our server code, and it just refreshed. Now, if I go back to the form HTML, refresh one more time, 1 and 2, and try to hit the submit button, you'll see that we are not getting a 404 anymore, and we're actually getting a 200. And right before that, we are trying to create a new user on line 12 over here. Okay, so now that we have our post request up and running, let's take a look at how we can actually get the data that we are entering inside of our form, for example, the first and last name. So console log, how do we get the form data? Well, this is pretty easy. If we modify the form HTML again, So let's go back to this file, and for each one of our input fields, I'm just going to give it a name property, and for this guy I'm going to call it create, and let's say underscore first name, and for the last name I'll do something very similar, so equals create and last name, so last name like that, and hopefully that's going to work. Let me save my HTML and refresh this guy. I'll hit 1 and 333 submit. And you'll see that we are going to actually get this data somehow inside of our post request. So let me hit save. And let me just try to refresh this user create and hit continue. And we'll see that we are trying to get the form data somehow inside of our user create request route. All right, so the question is, how exactly do I get the data that I punch inside of these two fields? Well, I'm going to show you how to do this, and I'll explain to you why we have to do this in just a little bit here. So bear with me. The first thing I'm going to do is to import another library called Body Parser. All right, so Body Parser, I haven't really installed it yet. So why don't I quit out of my server and say npm install body-parser like so, and it'll just install it onto my project. And let me just say node mod app.js again to start up my server. And if we open up package.json, you will see that we have body parser now included inside of the dependency, so that's pretty good. Going back to app.js, we are going to require to import body parser like so, and let's hit save, and you'll see that our server is up and running again. The next thing I would like to do is to use my body parser with app, and we'll use body parser like that, and we'll say, let's see, form, is it URL? Yeah, URL encoded, and we'll say, let's see over here, I think it's extended, and we'll just pass it a false. So what exactly is all this stuff over here? Well, this is something that's called a piece of middleware that helps you process your requests a little bit easier. And so once you have this bit of code that's looking at your request for you, you can go inside of your post request and you can actually get the data that you're passing into your actual form. So let's say we have first name of 1 and last name of 333. You can get it by saying request.body, and you can access create first name. And so let's copy this, and we'll just say console.log and say first name colon plus all of that over here. So let me just hit save with all my changes and my body parser thing up there. And I'm going to refresh this page, and we'll say Steph, and we'll say CCC, hit the submit button, and you'll see that the first name that we are entering inside of that form is actually Steph. And if you do the same thing with the last name, you'll obviously get that value printed out as well. So what I'm going to do now is to capture these two properties from my form inside of two variables. So let's say first name equals that over there, and const last name equals the same thing, but obviously we have to change this to create last name. So if you're not totally sure where this property is coming from, it's just pretty much whatever we named our input fields over here. So create first name and also create last name over there. So let's head back into app.js, and the thing I'm going to do now is to execute the SQL query that actually inputs this user inside of our database. So this is going to look pretty similar to what we did in the very last video of creating our connection and also executing this query. So let's see, how can I modify this code so that we reuse some of the things that we typed last time? Well, I'm going to refactor this code over here that creates our connection using these three properties. So let me just cut this and say get connection, and this is a new method that I'll create somewhere up here. So that's a function and get connection, and this guy will just return all that stuff that we had in the previous video. So we're just returning our connection, and everything is going to work just fine. So with this refactored method, I can simply say get connection, and this will get our connection, and we'll just execute a query directly like so. Now this query again takes in a parameter string or a query string. So why don't we create it up here as query string equals something. So I'm going to say insert into our users table, and the columns that we are going to modify is the first name and last name columns. And why don't I minimize this guy over here to get a little bit more space, and these guys will have the values of, let's see, question mark and comma question mark. Now this query string, we will pass it in as the first parameter over here, and for the two question marks we'll enter the values of first name from above and last name as well. So these two variables that we created, and finally we have to execute a callback whenever we're done inserting this information into MySQL. So the callback will say error, and we'll say results, and then the fields and the fat arrow, brace brace, and then we have to check the error. So let me just do this really quickly, and we'll say if there's an error, we'll console log it out as fail to insert new user, and then we will append the error onto it, and we'll say console, well not console, but res and send status of, let's say 500 for internal server error, and then finally we'll just return. All right, so that's how we kind of check for our error. And if we figure out that we inserted everything successfully, we can say something like console log and inserted. So let's make sure this is a string, inserted a new user with ID. So the question is, how exactly do we get the ID? Well, on the results thing over there, I believe we can say inserted ID. I don't think that's actually what it's called, so I'll show you how to figure out what these properties are. And we'll just say res and n like so. All right, so I'm just going to save again, and we will try to go back to the form HTML, and let's create a brand new user. We will call him John Stockton, and we'll hit the submit button over here, and it says that a user, we inserted a new user with this ID of undefined, which is result inserted ID. So this is not what the property is called, and that's why we're getting the undefined. If we go back to the user's route, we should be able to see John Stockton all the way at the very end over here with the ID of 15 and the first and last name of John Stockton. Okay, so quickly here before I end today's video, I want to show you how you can inspect your variables using NodeJS and Visual Studio Code. And this is actually pretty easy. I want to kill off my server down here. And let's go inside of the debug tab, which is this bug thing on the left side. And what I'm going to do is to actually hit this play button over here. And let me try to stop this as well. And if you are not able to start your debug correctly, you want to go inside of launch.json and make sure this file over here, app.js, is actually available. Now, I believe sometimes they call it index.js, so make sure to just modify it to app.js, hit the save, and now you can just run your debugger like that, and everything should be fine. So this turned orange, and I have this little window thing over here that allows me to stop and refresh the server. And if I go back to app.js over here, I can use a breakpoint on line 31, so just tap that over there. A red dot will appear. If you go back to your form, and let me just refresh this, and we will say Chris Webber is another NBA player. And if I hit the submit over here, it'll hit my user create post request as submit, and it'll actually stop at this breakpoint over here that I specified just a little bit earlier. If you go back into your debug tab, you can see what is inside of error, which is null because everything worked correctly, fields is undefined, and results is this thing over here that has a couple of these properties called affected rows because we inserted one row. The ID that we inserted is called insert ID. So we want to modify this to just say insert ID. That'll print out 16, and the rest of this stuff you can look at it, but it's not incredibly useful. And so you can go ahead and hit the play button. That will cause your application to continue. And so if you go back to users over here, that'll list out the user of Chris Webber, which has that ID of 16 over there. And that's how you would use Visual Studio Code to kind of step into exactly what your application is doing whenever you want to, using a breakpoint like so. Okay, everybody, I believe that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to use a post request inside of Node.js. So one big reason why you have to use a post request is because if you're trying to upload a file onto your server somewhere, the only way that you can do this is really through a post request, and you can't exactly do this using a regular GET request. So make sure you understand this topic, as it's very important if you want to actually build up your own custom backend solution. All right, that's going to be it for today's video. If you liked it, if you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and also consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this. The source code for today's project is available down below. That's going to be it for today. I will see you in the very next video. Bye bye, guys.